Good morning, everybody. In this second part of the presentation of our paper, we are going to present the results of a research project carried out in 2017 and 2018 by Fondazione Sabatini and Fondazione Di Vittorio, which decided to investigate the working condition inside the Italian plants of the FCA and CNH group. In particular, we're going to present some results related to the issue of the relationship between workers' health and safety and the execution of work. This is a topic which has a long-standing tradition in Italian labor movement, as you can see from this slide, in particular during the cycle of labor struggles that took place in the 60s and the 70s. Of the past century, there was a great attention, in particular, to the issues of workloads and workplaces as a potential source of great workers' fatigue and both psychological and physical distress. More recently, Tuccino and Fontana Tuccino, who are two Italian authors, decided to investigate the relationship, in particular, between the adoption of lean production systems in the automotive industry across Europe and workers' health. Their aim in particular was to understand which was the explanation of the observed increase in musculoskeletal disorders despite the adoption and the tendency of European car makers to adopt motion time systems that, at least officially, take into consideration risk assessment tools from the viewpoint of workers' ergonomics. So, drawing on these several sources of inspiration, our main research question, which animates the paper we are presenting, is essentially one, which you can read in the bottom part of the slide. And we asked basically how FCA and CNH workers' health and safety was affected by the introduction of some technological and organizational innovations, such as the world-class manufacturing production system and the Ergo UAS motion time system, explained and illustrated before by Matteo Gatti. We drew on both qualitative and quantitative methods of investigation. In particular, we administered a survey which involved a huge sample of FCA and CNH employees working in 54 Italian plants in 2017 and 2018. There were almost 10,000 respondents. And furthermore, we also deployed, as said before, qualitative methods of analysis since we carried out 170 semi-structured interviews, which involved FCA and CNH employees working in 16 plants. So coming from a subsample of the 54 Italian plants which compose the whole FCA group. The tables that you're going to see in the next slides are based on a subsample of these almost 10,000 respondents. This subsample is composed of a little more than 500 respondents, than 500 workers. Since the Ergo UAS motion time system was adopted and introduced in just 17 Italian plants of the FCA group out of the 54 Italian plants that were investigated overall. And we also decided to focus only on assembly line workers since, as you can imagine, they were the most affected by the introduction of a new motion time system. As you can see in the table on the left side of this slide, one of the questions we asked in the survey in order to investigate the impact on workers' health and safety produced by the Ergo UAS motion time system asked workers to express their views and opinions about the change of their workload after the introduction of Ergo UAS. And as you can see, almost 4 workers out of 5 stated that their workload increased, and as a consequence, their workload worsened. This result is not surprising in our opinion, since the Ergo UAS motion time system tends to produce a net increase in workloads sometimes corresponding also to a 10% net increase in workloads, if compared with the previous with the motion time systems previously adopted in FCA and CNH plants. Associated to this, we also asked workers to express their view about the impact of ERGO-UAS system on their physical and mental distress. And as you can see in the table on the right side of the slide, there seems to be an almost perfect correlation between the increasing workload and the worsening of mental and physical distress. So also in this case, the highest percentage of respondents, 79.1% of workers involved in the survey, states that the physical and mental distress worsen. We also tried in the paper to understand what could be the interpretation of this kind of stress, in particular with respect to previous studies that were conducted in FCA and CNH plants before our research, dealing with the same issue. So dealing with the adoption of a lean production system, the introduction of the world-class manufacturing production system, and its impact on working condition and workers' perceptions. According to Luciano Pero, which is quoted in the first line of this slide, worker stress inside FCA and CNH plants can also be seen not just as the outcome of the introduction of the ERGO-UAS system, but also as the outcome of the introduction of employee involvement practices, in particular of suggestion mechanisms, which in a way put a higher degree of social pressure over workers to perform better and better. So in a way, according to this research, which was carried out in 2014 and 2015, one of the main sources of worker stress is related to employee involvement practices. In a way, these authors tend to emphasize more the psychological dimension of worker stress rather than the physical one determined by the increasing workloads and workplaces we have seen before. Something really similar to this kind of interpretation of workers' distress was advanced by Alberto Cipriani, who is an official of one of the unions which signed the collective bargaining agreement which introduced this kind of production systems inside the FCA and CNH plants. In the opinion of Alberto Cipriani, who is interviewed by Bertoncini in 2014, workers' distress increased because they are required now to use not only their arms while at work, but also their cognitive abilities. So the idea to continuously produce suggestions in order to foster continuous improvement achievements inside plants can be considered one of the major sources of stress beyond the increasing workloads and work paces. Overall, this strand of research and this group of authors tend to say that in light of the introduction of employee involvement practices related to lean production systems, the barriers between engineers and assembly line workers are even dissolving. In our opinion, this kind of interpretation of worker stress inside FCA and CNH plants cannot be considered complete. Especially if we consider the insights coming from the qualitative part of our research, where we, in a way, discovered how psychological stress is mainly the result of performance pressures to get work done. And this is interesting also because in the survey, workers identified the performance pressure to get work done as one of the three main injury risk factors, together with the reduction in the time allotted to complete their tasks and the reduction of space along the assembly lines, which leave and allow left room for workers' movements. As you can see in this quotation, taking taken from the qualitative part of our research. This worker, for example, says that there was a clear worsening in terms of psychological stress, mainly coming from the idea of the management to make workers work at their hardest possible level. So in a way, the psychological pressure is the result, at least in our opinion, of hierarchical differences inside factories that still tend to persist beyond the rhetoric in a way which wants hierarchies inside lean factories to flatten and flatten. So coming quite quickly to the conclusions of our work. On our side, it doesn't seem too much that workers of FCA and CNH plants are projected in a way into the factory of the future. What we found indeed was something really similar to the factory of the past. And in particular, we are referring to a workers' inquiry which was conducted at the end of the 90s by Giovanni Carocci. Giovanni Carocci actually found that workers' overall feeling of fatigue and exasperation towards a work that tends to become obsessive was one of the main features in a context of disciplinary pressure coming from the hierarchical structure of the factory, and in a context where work paces and workloads tended to increase. So in this sense, we found strong similarities between the factory investigated in 2017 and 2018 and the factory of the past. So far, what we have seen is mainly a series of results that come from a research project that was carried out before the pandemic. But at the same time, in the conclusion of our paper, we tried to sketch out what are the main risks for workers' health and safety during and after the pandemic. So we decided to outline what is the situation of health at work during the COVID-19 crisis. And indeed, we identify a series of aspects which seem to structurally depend on the adoption of lean production systems that are unable, at least in our opinion, to protect workers' health in an effective way. The main issues of concern with respect to this point is the fact, for example, are several. One of these issues is represented by the fact that, for example, the use of individual protective equipment such as masks tends to increase workers' fatigue, and this should be carefully considered when implementing the cycle time. So a sort of rest factor should be assigned to workers in order to allow them to recover from the increasing fatigue determined by the use of this protective equipment. Another issue is the distinction between non-value-added activities and value-added activities met by the management. In our opinion, this distinction has the final result to increase the saturation of the different workstations along the assembly line in order to achieve savings both in terms of personnel and space. And of course, this can impede and prevent from respecting the physical distancing between workers, which is required by the protocols negotiated between companies and trade unions after the first lockdown measures in 2020 in order to reopen the factories which were closed by the lockdown measures, at the same time protecting workers' health and safety during the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, we state that the increasing digitalization and the increasing adoption of systems such as the MES, the manufacturing execution system, and the overall feeling of surveillance produced by these kind of tools cannot help respect the provision of the protocols in terms of protection of workers' health and safety because of their tendency to produce and determine a sense of anxiety, of psychological pressure, and of course, are in contrast with the idea of effectively protecting workers' health and safety. Thank you very much.